You can do now if you know what you're looking for.
Yeah, yeah.
If you don't let the guys in the shop make it sound so really like good through loads of shit.
Imagine becoming one of the most recognizable faces in America, only for history to almost erase your name. That's exactly what happened to Garry Moore. During television's golden age, millions of families welcomed him into their living rooms nearly every night. He wasn't loud or flashy. He didn't rely on outrageous stunts or controversy. Instead, his calm voice, warm smile, and effortless charm made people feel like they were spending time with an old friend. For nearly 2 decades, he dominated American television, hosting some of the country's biggest programs while earning awards and the admiration of viewers everywhere. Yet today, ask someone under 50 who Garry Moore was, and chances are they'll have no idea. It's one of television's greatest mysteries. How does someone who once ruled prime time simply disappear from public memory? But fading from history wasn't the strangest part of his story. Behind that reassuring smile was a man carrying secrets that even his closest audience never suspected. And the deeper you look, the more unbelievable his life becomes. But before those secrets surfaced, another mystery had already begun. To millions of Americans, Garry Moore represented stability. Every week he welcomed contestants, celebrities, and audiences with the same relaxed confidence that made everything seem effortless. While other entertainers chased attention with oversized personalities, Moore did the exact opposite. He listened carefully, laughed naturally, and made every guest feel comfortable. That rare ability turned him into one of CBS's biggest stars almost overnight. Sponsors fought for advertising space on his programs because viewers trusted him completely. Families planned their evenings around his shows, and television executives considered him one of the safest investments in entertainment. But television only showed one side of the man. The audience believed they knew Garry Moore because he spent years encouraging strangers to reveal their deepest secrets. Ironically, while everyone else opened up under the studio lights, Moore quietly protected truths about himself that would remain hidden for decades. Even something as basic as his own identity wasn't entirely real. And once you learn where he actually came from, everything starts to make much more sense. Long before America knew him as Garry Moore, he was born Thomas Garrison Morfitt in Baltimore, Maryland. Coming from a respected family, everyone expected him to follow a predictable path into law or another prestigious profession. Instead, Thomas had completely different plans. He dreamed of writing plays and creating stories that would entertain audiences far beyond his hometown. After leaving school, he threw himself into local theater, determined to build a creative career despite disappointing nearly everyone around him. Then fate stepped in. A temporary writing job at a radio station introduced him to broadcasting almost by accident. When an on-air performer failed to show up, Thomas was pushed in front of the microphone with almost no preparation. To everyone's surprise, including his own, listeners loved him. There was just one problem. Station executives thought Thomas Morfitt sounded awkward and forgettable on the radio. So they did something almost unheard of. They asked listeners to choose him a brand new name. One winning suggestion changed his identity forever. But changing his name was only the beginning of the transformation. Before radio changed everything, Thomas believed he would spend his life writing for the theater. He poured countless hours into creating comedy sketches and one-act plays, hoping one of them would become his big breakthrough. Along the way, he found himself working alongside an unexpected figure, Zelda Fitzgerald, the wife of legendary novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald. For a struggling young writer, it seemed like the opportunity of a lifetime. Suddenly, doors that once looked permanently closed began to crack open. It felt as though success in the literary world was finally within reach. But reality had other plans. None of the plays achieved the success he dreamed about, and the career he'd imagined slowly slipped away. At first, it looked like devastating failure. Looking back, it turned out to be the greatest twist of luck he could have asked for. Those connections led him toward radio, where an entirely different future was waiting. What seemed like the end of one dream became the unexpected beginning of something much bigger. And soon, one legendary entertainer would completely change the course of his career. By the early 1940s, Garry Moore had quietly built a reputation as someone who could make almost any broadcast feel natural. That talent caught the attention of producers searching for the perfect partner for one of America's biggest entertainers, Jimmy Durante. Durante's explosive personality filled every room he entered, but he needed someone calm enough to balance the chaos. Moore turned out to be exactly that person. Their chemistry was instant, creating one of radio's most successful partnerships. While Durante delivered the loud jokes and larger-than-life performances, Moore became the steady voice that kept everything moving. Audiences loved the contrast, and before long, millions were tuning in every week just to hear the two interact. Those years taught Moore a lesson that would define his entire career. People didn't just enjoy being entertained, they loved feeling comfortable. That comforting presence would soon carry him from radio into the brand new world of television, where his greatest success and his deepest hidden struggles were still waiting just beyond the spotlight. What started as a lucky break quickly became one of the fastest rises in broadcasting. After adopting the name Garry Moore, he moved from station to station, sharpening his skills as an announcer, comedian, and writer. Every city seemed to open a bigger door than the last. By the time he arrived in New York, producers had begun to notice something unusual. Moore wasn't the funniest person in the room, nor the loudest. His gift was making everyone around him shine. Guests felt relaxed, audiences trusted him, and fellow performers loved working beside him. That rare ability was impossible to teach, and networks realized they had found someone special. Soon, one opportunity after another landed in his lap, each larger than the last. Before long, the man who had never planned on becoming a performer was preparing to enter an entirely new medium that would transform American entertainment forever. Television was still finding its identity, and Garry Moore was about to help define it. But no one could have predicted just how quickly his popularity would explode. When Garry Moore stepped onto television, the timing couldn't have been better. America was falling in love with the small screen, and viewers were searching for familiar faces they could trust. Moore fit that role perfectly. His variety show mixed music, comedy, celebrity interviews, and lighthearted conversation into something families could enjoy together. Ratings climbed almost immediately, and sponsors rushed to buy advertising time. Within just a few years, his program had become one of CBS's biggest financial successes, generating enormous revenue for the network. But Moore wasn't satisfied with hosting just one hit show. While most entertainers struggled to manage a single weekly program, he was juggling radio broadcasts, daytime television, and primetime appearances all at once. It seemed impossible, yet he made every performance look effortless. Viewers never saw the exhausting schedule hidden behind his easy smile. They only saw America's newest television favorite, and then came the show that would make his name unforgettable, at least for a while. In 1952, Garry Moore became the face of a simple game show with an unforgettable idea. Contestants would whisper a secret into his ear, while a panel of celebrities tried to uncover it by asking only yes or no questions. The format sounded almost too simple to succeed, yet audiences couldn't get enough. Moore's calm personality transformed every episode into something far more personal than a typical game show. He never mocked contestants or tried to steal the spotlight. Instead, he made every person feel important, no matter how unusual their story might be. Week after week, viewers tuned in, not only to discover the hidden secrets, but to watch the genuine conversations unfold. Soon, I've Got a Secret became one of the most beloved programs in America, running for over a decade and making Moore one of television's highest-paid stars. But some of the secrets revealed on that stage would become far more historic than anyone could have imagined. Some episodes of I've Got a Secret felt less like television and more like living history. One unforgettable guest was a 95-year-old man named Samuel Seymour. At first glance, he looked like any elderly contestant. Then his secret stunned the audience. As a 5-year-old child, he had witnessed the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater. Suddenly, one ordinary television episode became a direct connection to one of America's most famous historical moments. Only weeks after appearing on the show, Seymour passed away, making the broadcast one of the last opportunities anyone would have to hear his remarkable story. Years later, another quiet couple appeared with a different secret. Their son had recently been selected as one of NASA's newest astronauts. During the interview, Garry Moore casually wondered what it would be like if their son someday walked on the moon. 7 years later, that prediction became reality. Their son was Neil Armstrong. Somehow, history kept finding its way onto Moore's stage. But his greatest contribution to television wasn't a contestant. It was a future superstar. While audiences admired Garry Moore as a host, many entertainers remembered him for something even greater. He had an extraordinary eye for talent. When a young comedian named Carol Burnett auditioned for his show, Moore recognized her potential almost instantly. Instead of making her wait through endless auditions, he reportedly told her, "You're on this Friday." That single decision changed television history. Burnett would later call Moore one of the kindest and most influential people she had ever worked with, crediting him with helping launch her career. She wasn't the only one. Performers like Don Knotts, Jonathan Winters, Don Adams, and several other future stars all received valuable national exposure through his programs. Unlike many television personalities who feared being overshadowed, Moore genuinely celebrated the success of others. Helping new talent rise seemed to bring him as much joy as his own achievements. From the outside, he appeared to have everything anyone could want: fame, respect, and a flawless reputation. But behind the cameras, the pressure of maintaining that perfect image was beginning to take a hidden toll. Success looked effortless from the outside, but behind the cameras, Garry Moore was carrying a workload few people could survive. At the peak of his career, he wasn't hosting just one hit show, he was balancing daytime television, primetime broadcasts, and radio, often with barely enough time to catch his breath. Every appearance demanded the same warmth, the same smile, and the same calm personality audiences expected. No matter how exhausting life became, viewers never saw him lose control. That polished image became both his greatest strength and his biggest burden. While millions admired the cheerful host on their screens, almost no one realized how much pressure had built up behind the scenes. The constant pace left little room for rest, reflection, or even a normal personal life. Eventually, the strain became impossible to ignore. And when Garry Moore made his next decision, it stunned both fans and television executives alike. By 1964, Garry Moore had reached the kind of success most entertainers spend a lifetime chasing. His shows ranked among the biggest on television, advertisers competed for airtime, and his reputation was stronger than ever. Then, without warning, he announced he was stepping away. Fans couldn't understand why someone at the top of the industry would voluntarily leave it behind. Moore simply explained that he was tired and felt he had already said everything he wanted to say. On the surface, it sounded reasonable. After nearly 3 decades of non-stop performing, anyone would be exhausted. But those closest to the situation suspected there was much more beneath that simple explanation. The endless schedule had drained him physically and emotionally, while private struggles remained carefully hidden from the public. His departure wasn't just about taking a vacation, it was an attempt to escape a life that had slowly become overwhelming. Yet leaving television wouldn't make those hidden battles disappear. Instead of chasing another television contract, Garry Moore did something few celebrities would ever consider. He disappeared from the spotlight almost completely. Together with his wife Eleanor, he spent years sailing around the world, trading bright studio lights for open water and quiet horizons. Friends noticed how much happier he seemed away from cameras, deadlines, and constant public attention. Out on the ocean, there were no ratings to worry about, no scripts to memorize, and no expectations to meet. It was the closest thing to freedom he had experienced in decades. But television has a way of calling its biggest stars back. As audiences continued to remember him fondly, CBS believed the country was ready for Garry Moore's return. The network offered him another chance at prime time, promising a comeback worthy of his legendary reputation. Unfortunately, both television and America had already begun to change in ways no one expected. When Garry Moore returned to television in 1966, expectations were enormous. CBS promoted his comeback heavily, convinced audiences would welcome back one of the medium's biggest stars. But the television landscape had shifted during his absence. Viewers were embracing faster-paced entertainment, newer personalities, and different styles of comedy. Moore remained the same thoughtful, gentle host people had always loved, yet suddenly that familiar approach felt old-fashioned to many viewers. Ratings failed to meet expectations, critics were less enthusiastic than before, and the revived show disappeared after only a short run. For the first time in years, Garry Moore experienced something he rarely had during his career: public disappointment. Still, he refused to become bitter. Instead of blaming audiences or the network, he accepted that entertainment was evolving. Soon, another opportunity arrived, one that carried an irony almost impossible to ignore, and it would place him face to face with the very truth he had spent years hiding. In 1969, Garry Moore accepted the role of hosting To Tell the Truth, a game show built around one simple question: who is telling the truth? Every episode challenged contestants to separate honesty from deception, while Moore calmly guided the conversation with the same reassuring presence audiences had trusted for years. To viewers, it seemed like the perfect role for a man whose entire career had been built on credibility. But behind that familiar smile, Moore was protecting a truth of his own that almost nobody knew. While encouraging contestants to reveal themselves honestly, he continued hiding deeply personal struggles that had followed him throughout much of his adult life. The contrast was almost unbelievable. America saw him as the picture of stability, yet privately, he was fighting battles few could imagine. Before long, those hidden struggles would become impossible to keep secret, leading to the most emotional moment of his entire career. For years, Garry Moore had mastered the art of appearing perfectly composed. Viewers saw confidence, kindness, and quiet professionalism every time he stepped in front of a camera. But behind closed doors, another story was unfolding, one he fought to keep hidden from almost everyone around him. Like countless public figures of his generation, Moore struggled with alcoholism during years when the condition was often misunderstood and surrounded by shame. Instead of asking for help publicly, he carried the burden in silence, determined that his audience would never notice. Every broadcast required him to smile as though nothing was wrong. Every interview demanded the same dependable personality America expected. The pressure of protecting that image became exhausting. Yet Moore continued to perform, without revealing what he was facing. Eventually, he realized that keeping the secret was becoming more painful than telling the truth. And in 1976, he made a decision that shocked nearly everyone who knew him. On May 9, 1976, Garry Moore walked into a hotel ballroom in Washington, D.C., where more than 50 well-known Americans gathered for an extraordinary event. One after another, each person stood before reporters and publicly admitted something they had spent years hiding: they were recovering alcoholics. Athletes, politicians, actors, and public figures all took part, hoping to change how the nation viewed addiction. Then, Garry Moore stood up. For millions watching the news, it was almost impossible to believe. The gentle television host, who had spent decades asking contestants to reveal their secrets, was finally revealing his own. He spoke calmly, explaining that too many people had stayed silent because they feared judgment. His honesty instantly became one of the event's defining moments. Instead of damaging his reputation, the confession earned widespread respect. Viewers saw not weakness, but extraordinary courage. Yet while one hidden battle had finally been exposed, another dangerous habit was still silently threatening his future. Long before health warnings appeared on every cigarette pack, smoking was considered completely normal on television. Garry Moore rarely appeared without a cigarette close by, whether backstage or relaxing between broadcasts. Few people questioned the habit because nearly everyone around him smoked as well. Decades passed before the devastating consequences began to emerge. What once seemed harmless slowly became a serious threat to the very thing that had made him famous: his voice. For a television host whose career depended on speaking with warmth and clarity, there could hardly have been a crueler twist. Doctors eventually delivered the news no performer ever wants to hear. Moore had developed throat cancer. Suddenly, the man whose voice had comforted millions was fighting to keep it. Years of quiet habit had finally caught up with him, and this battle couldn't be hidden behind a friendly smile. But even as his health declined, Garry Moore refused to let illness define the final chapter of his remarkable life. Treatment for throat cancer forced Garry Moore into one of the hardest battles he had ever faced. Surgery threatened not only his health, but also the voice that audiences had trusted for decades. Every conversation became a reminder of what was at stake. For someone whose entire career revolved around speaking, the possibility of permanent damage was heartbreaking. Determined not to give up, Moore underwent treatment and gradually recovered enough to make one final return to television. Fans were relieved to see him back, but they also sensed something had changed. He no longer chased ratings or awards. Instead, he seemed grateful simply to stand before an audience again. In 1977, after hosting one more season premiere, Garry Moore quietly announced his retirement. There were no dramatic farewell speeches or emotional goodbyes, just the same grace that had defined his entire career. Still, another deeply personal loss was waiting just beyond the cameras. Even before retiring, Garry Moore had experienced heartbreak that few viewers ever knew about. His beloved wife, Eleanor, whom he had known since his teenage years, passed away after decades of marriage. The loss deeply affected him, yet true to form, he rarely spoke publicly about his grief. Later, he remarried and chose a far quieter life, settling away from the relentless pace of television. He spent his days sailing, writing humorous newspaper columns, and enjoying the peace he had searched for throughout his career. Fame no longer seemed important to him. In fact, he often joked that the only reason people still remembered him was because old reruns occasionally appeared on television. It was classic Garry Moore, humble, self-deprecating, and never seeking attention. But time was running out. The years of smoking had caused lasting damage, and one final chapter would soon bring an emotional close to the life of one of television's greatest, forgotten pioneers. After decades spent under studio lights, Garry Moore stepped away without fanfare. There were no grand farewell specials or emotional farewell tours. In 1977, after making one final appearance on To Tell the Truth, he simply announced that it was time to move on. It was a fitting ending for a man who had never craved the spotlight as much as the work itself. While many television stars fought desperately to stay relevant, Moore seemed content to let the next generation take over. He settled in Hilton Head, South Carolina, where life moved at a completely different pace. He spent summers in Maine, sailed whenever he could, and even wrote a humorous newspaper column that reflected the same warmth audiences had loved for decades. Friends noticed he seemed happier living quietly than he ever had surrounded by cameras. Yet the damage caused by years of smoking continued to grow, and despite defeating throat cancer, another illness was slowly closing in. The final curtain was approaching, whether America was ready or not. For years, Garry Moore had managed to overcome challenge after challenge. He survived career setbacks, public pressure, personal loss, and even throat cancer. But one lifelong habit continued taking its toll long after the cameras stopped rolling. Decades of heavy smoking had severely damaged his lungs, eventually leading to emphysema. Unlike the fast-paced world of television, this illness moved slowly and relentlessly. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden collapse, just a gradual loss of strength that made everyday life increasingly difficult. Family members watched as the energetic performer who had once entertained millions began living a much quieter existence. Despite everything, Moore rarely complained. Those who visited him remembered the same gentle humor and kindness that had always defined him. He remained grateful for the remarkable career he'd experienced, rather than bitter about the one he had left behind. Then, on November 28, 1993, the voice that had comforted generations of television viewers finally fell silent. But even in death, one final surprise remained. When Garry Moore passed away at the age of 78, newspapers across America honored one of television's true pioneers. Yet at his burial site in Northeast Harbor, Maine, visitors wouldn't find the name that millions had known for decades. Instead, the headstone read, Thomas Garrison Morfitt, the name he had been born with nearly 8 decades earlier. It was a powerful reminder of the 2 lives he had lived. The public knew Garry Moore, the trusted television host with the friendly smile and calming voice. His family laid to rest Thomas Morfitt, the private man who had spent years carrying burdens few people ever saw. Somehow, the ending perfectly reflected the story of his life. Even after death, there remained a quiet separation between the celebrity America adored and the person behind that carefully crafted image. Yet when historians look back at television's golden age, one fact becomes impossible to ignore. His influence reached far beyond the programs he hosted. Although Garry Moore's name isn't mentioned as often today, his fingerprints remain all over modern television. He helped launch the careers of Carol Burnett, Don Knotts, Jonathan Winters, Don Adams, and countless others who later became household names. His interview style inspired generations of hosts who discovered that kindness could be just as compelling as confrontation. Long before reality television and viral interviews, Moore proved audiences were fascinated by ordinary people telling extraordinary stories. He also stood at the center of unforgettable moments in history, from interviewing one of the last living witnesses to Abraham Lincoln's assassination to welcoming the parents of Neil Armstrong years before the moon landing changed the world. Yet perhaps his greatest contribution had nothing to do with ratings or awards. By publicly acknowledging his struggle with alcoholism, he helped reduce the stigma surrounding recovery at a time when very few public figures dared to speak openly. In many ways, that single act of honesty became his most meaningful performance of all. There's a heartbreaking irony at the center of Garry Moore's story. For more than 20 years, he built a career asking one unforgettable question: what's your secret? Every episode encouraged strangers to reveal the hidden parts of their lives, while he quietly guided the conversation with compassion and understanding. Yet the person holding the answer card was carrying secrets of his own the entire time. He hid his personal struggles, protected his private pain, and maintained the reassuring image America expected until the day he finally chose honesty over silence. By doing so, he reminded millions that even the people who seem strongest are often fighting battles no one else can see. Fame eventually faded, television evolved, and newer stars replaced the familiar face that once welcomed families into their living rooms every week. But perhaps that's exactly why Garry Moore deserves to be remembered today. Not simply as a legendary television host, but as a man whose greatest act wasn't entertaining America. It was finding the courage to tell the truth about himself when it mattered most.